How we doing out there, good people of the world? I'm very much in my film snob era these days, so I thought I'd make one of those Criterion closet style videos. But of course I can't go to the actual Criterion closet because I'm just some guy, so I guess I'll just try to make like a shitty low budget version of it myself at my house. Hopefully I can be as entertaining as Dick Cavett. So, where do we want to start with these? So first up we have Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters. I'm trying to imitate the cadence of somebody taking it off the shelf and holding it up to the camera. Anyway, going into this I did very little research, and in this case perhaps I should have done some research. I think I would have been better served by doing so. I knew that this was a biopic about a controversial Japanese artist, I knew that much, but looking back, I guess what I didn't know at the time, that this is very much what the youngsters would call an incel movie. Not a movie for incels necessarily, but about one. He's got all the trappings of a modern-day incel, it's just that people didn't call it that back then. Just a very frustrated young man who kind of resorts to violence when he can't get his way. And that's the thing, this is based on a real-life guy, and in all of his writings, it was kind of forecasted that he was going to have like a big dramatic end to his life. I mean, the first thing that he wrote about was a story about a young man with a stutter and likely some other mental disabilities, and as a young man he was, dealing with some very serious feelings of sexual frustration, and this resulted in him trying to burn down the temple at one point because, if he couldn't get his way, then nobody could, That sort of thing. I guess that type of person's always been around in life. We just hadn't really had a name for it until the past 10, 15 years or so. But anyway, I definitely appreciated some of the sets that they did. Very well done, I must say. Just look at that. And Philip Glass did an excellent job with the score, certainly. He's a very talented man. I'll pull up my notes here. Anyway, and just the way that his whole life story came together so perfectly at the end, and he essentially became one of his own characters. They had like a quick montage of how all of his characters died in different ways, right before Mishima himself also died in a very similar fashion, and it's just so poetic, They did an excellent job with this one. This one definitely gets an endorsement from me. The next one I wanted to talk about was Redis from the World Cinema Project box set. This one's pretty straightforward plot-wise. It doesn't really do anything too fantastical. There's no meta-narratives or anything, but that's to be expected for a movie that's this old since it came out in 1936. I think just the history of how this film got to be made is more interesting than the actual film itself. It's just the logistics of trying to shoot a movie in Mexico in 1936 was very difficult to do. Just physically trying to move a camera and equipment down into Mexico back then, when they would have been very lacking in infrastructure with things like roads, for example. Doing that was quite the challenge. Just physically getting the camera there, and then the original camera broke as well, and they had to get a new one down there. And the original film strip that they made back in the 1930s, that was sent to France afterwards for storage purposes. And apparently the original film strip was destroyed by the Nazis during World War II when they invaded France, although that claim's kind of disputed, but that's what the director claimed, I guess. And so this film was lost media for many years, and then all the way later in the 2000s, there was a backup copy of the film that was sent to the World Cinema Project for, to give it a proper home media release. And now it's available for buck-toothed, unibrowed idiots like us to watch. Isn't that just great? I feel like there was... Oh yeah, so the whole purpose of how this film got to be made is it was commissioned by the Socialist Party of Mexico for educational purposes. It was supposed to be 1 out of 5 films that they were going to make. But unfortunately, this was the only one that got done. The other four, it just wasn't going to happen with all of the problems they were having on set. In addition to the logistical problems they were having, there were also kind of arguments among the cast and crew, in terms of how the movie should get made. And then also there was a scene where they needed to pull the net up and get a big, they needed to have a bunch of fish in the net at once. The plot needed that, and unfortunately the fish weren't biting that day when they were filming, which kind of complicated things. But this one's at least mildly interesting at best. This is a solid 6.5 out of 10. Next up, I wanted to look at Tuki Buki from Senegal. And before we get into that, I think this film really just stands as a testament to just how valuable of a service the World Cinema Project provides to movie buffs out there, just the lengths that they go to preserve obscure media. Because in the case of this film, this was shown at a festival just twice. It had just 2 public airings, once in Germany and once in Russia, and then it was presumably never seen again. And then somehow the World Cinema Project was able to track down the original film reel in the 2000s, and they were able to restore it. Just something so obscure, something that had 2 public airings and never again. 2 public airings 30 years ago, mind you. And they managed to preserve it. Now the film itself, there really seems to be a strong emphasis on sound design. And to understand why that is, you gotta at least partially understand the director's backstory. The director, as a kid, growing up in Senegal in, I guess, trying to do the math in my head here, what decade that would have been. Either way, he couldn't afford to go to the cinema as a kid, so he would just sit outside the cinema and just listen to what the movie was doing. And that gave him a very deep appreciation for the sound of movies and how that should all work. And that really translates into the film. There's that one song that they have that it's very much an earworm that'll stick with you long after the movie has ended.
Paris, 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 c'est sur la terre un coin de paradis.
And also the symbolism of how that song was used, and just the fact that it never completes. It just presents the idea of France in the song without actually finishing the song, which of course symbolizes the fact that our 2 main characters never do actually get to France at the end of the film. Spoiler alert, I guess. And speaking of sound, there's one scene that I'm kind of glad probably didn't have sound. They just had music over muted footage of it. There was that extremely graphic scene with the cow at the start. I mean, I guess, since this was filmed on a whole nother continent, the rules of what you can and can't show are a bit different, so it's a bit looser. It's just goodness gracious, that is just so over the top. I can't believe that's in here. That's the one reason I don't really recommend this movie to other people. I mean, I love the film, make no mistake, but I can't tell other people to watch it. I can't recommend it to people. They're going to say, okay, yeah, I'll watch it, and then, Jesus Christ, you can't do that. But overall, I was very impressed at how they managed to pull this off. When one thinks African cinema, you'd probably expect something more in line with Who Killed Captain Alex, where it's just a $50 camcorder recording people doing karate badly at their house. You kind of expect something like that, so the fact that something that was produced in Senegal in the 1970s really seemed to be comparable in quality to something that you'd see in the West, honestly, I was just floored that they managed to pull that off. They just completely defied my very narrow expectations of what international cinema could be. Just looking at some of the things that people have said about this on Letterboxd, and also looking through the booklet that came included with the World Cinema Project box set, I will contend that there's probably an additional layer to this film that I'm not quite smart enough to understand, but I do recognize that it's there. For example, here's a passage from the booklet. It says, Tuki Buki refuses to endorse either a nostalgic view of the African past or a blinkered enthusiasm for the contemporary mores and ideology of progress. And then later in the book it also mentions the symbolism of hyenas vis-a-vis African culture and what that means to African people. These are the type of references that would very much be lost on me, a humble Midwestern mook. But that's not to say I didn't enjoy the film. There's just something weirdly fascinating about it that I can't quite put my finger on. There's that feeling that I'm missing one last piece of the puzzle to finally get the full picture of what's trying to be said there. And I think that's a big part of why this one continues to linger in my mind for so long. I also wanted to talk about The Housemaid from 1960. Going into this one, I guess I didn't really have any experience with Korean cinema per se, so I guess I didn't really know where to place my expectations. I guess I was just kind of generalizing Asian cinema more broadly, and I was expecting this to be comparable to maybe like some Japanese films that I had seen. That is to say, completely and totally over the top. And it wasn't quite that necessarily. Make no mistake, there was lots of craziness in the movie, especially the part where the pregnant lady throws herself down the stairs. But still, it didn't quite have the level of pizzazz that I was expecting. I guess on some level I was a bit bored here and there, which seems silly to say given the plot of the movie that I would be bored by all of this, but I guess I was expecting something more comparable to like House or Tetsuo the Iron Man, and it's crazy, but not that crazy, for heaven's sake. But, yeah, I don't know if I'd really recommend this one necessarily. Just some other interesting trivia about this one. The film reel that they used for the Blu-ray, it decays in a few spots, and I guess they couldn't fix it. So occasionally you'll just have like a 20-minute section of the film where the quality just takes an enormous nosedive, and suddenly there's visible film grain and the resolution drops considerably, and really just reminds you that you're watching a very old film all of a sudden. And I guess that in itself is part of the film's history now, because that's probably as good as the restoration's gonna get. So whenever people watch this in the future, that's gonna be a point of discussion, the fact that the quality degrades for sections of it. But anyway, this film, even though it's mostly been forgotten, it does have a pretty important place in cinema history, because this ended up being a fairly large inspiration for Bong Joon-ho when he made the movie Parasite, which I haven't seen, but he's mentioned that The Housemaid was a big inspiration for him, so at least we can say that, this film was used to create something better many decades later. And Bong Joon-ho was even one of the people they interviewed on the extras on the DVD, so there's that too. Now for A River Called Tatash, I saw about half of it. I thought I'd finish it later at some point, but that's the thing, you never want to fall into the I'll finish it later trap with movies, because it seems like later never comes. If a movie if it's not able to keep your attention for the whole thing the first go around, it's probably not going to be enticing enough for you to go back to it 3 weeks to a month later. That's what happened to me with this one. I liked it decently, but there was this one particular scene where I could really start to feel the movie magic kind of kicking in when the guy's wife gets kidnapped on the boat, and the night sky in the background is particularly dark, and you can tell they just had like a backdrop of some kind that very clearly wasn't an actual night sky, and you can faintly hear the Indian music kick in as the guy kind of reaches out towards the sea and mourns the loss of his wife. For that one moment, I could feel kind of gripped by what they were trying to do. It felt like things were really taking off, but I wasn't able to get all the way through it. Although I certainly have to give credit to the director Rishwak Ghatak for some of the really good scenes that I liked. There were some excellent shots in the parts that I did see. There was at the opening where you could see the raindrops making the ripples in the mud. That was very well done, and I like the really far shot of the boat, where the woman's looking at the boats going out to sea, and you can just very, very faintly see the man on the boat who's like working the sails. He's just like this tiny little dot because he's so far away. Brilliant shot. Really like that part. Now to wrap things up, I wanted to do a rapid fire to just quickly look through some of the other films in my collection that I haven't yet seen, but I have some early impressions of. Inland Empire is very much an auteur type of film, that is to say, when the director is just given complete and total creative control, they can just do whatever they want to the point where it's like they're the author of the film, essentially. This is just pure, just distilled, just David Lynch doing whatever the heck he wants. Doesn't care if it makes sense initially, just just a genius at work doing whatever he wants to do, and I'm very much interested to see how this turns out, although I hear that's kind of a controversial thing and that kind of makes it a hard watch in spots. Just normal David Lynch films are already a bit confusing as is, and this is just dialing the David Lynch factor up to as far as it can go, so it should be interesting to see how this one turns out. Fantastic Planet is the only animated film in my collection thus far, and this one has an endorsement from MF Doom of all people. I've spoken about Tetsuyo the Iron Man separately in another video, but people say the sequel is even worse somehow. Not worse in terms of being a shitty movie, but you see what I'm getting at. Anyway, and I find that a bit hard to believe. I guess I'll have to see it myself and find out. Tampopo is described as the type of movie, according to somebody on Letterboxd, it's described as the type of movie when you're hungry and horny at the same time and you don't want to pick a lane. Mysterious Object at Noon has a very unusual premise, like there's this exercise that you might have done in school many years ago, like a writing exercise where like somebody writes part of a story, then they pass it down to another kid and they add on to the story, and everybody does that, and the director essentially made a movie following that premise, just walking up to various people in Thailand and asking them to continue a story that's already going, and as you can imagine, it's probably just complete and total chaos. According to the booklet that came with the box set, they said it's made obtuse on purpose, and sometimes they'll inject parts of a different person's part of the story where their part already ended, but they'll try to continue it and try to fuse it with somebody who's, 3 people down the line later, which makes things a bit obtuse at times. That this one might be a bit of a challenging watch. And lastly, I wanted to talk about Revenge. From what I know about this movie, this was made in Kazakhstan in the 1980s, and at that point the entire country of Kazakhstan was so poor that they didn't even have anybody in the entire country who could be considered like a trained actor, so they had to fly in a bunch of Koreans to act out the scenes. Anyway, I want to see this just for the simple fact that this doesn't look like anything visually. This just looks so distinct from anything else that's out there. Gotta see what this is about.